Hello, hello. Welcome to PCAP's annual Prairie's Got the Goods Week. This week features a webinar series about ecological goods and services provided by the native prairie ecosystem. My name is Caitlin Moreau-Seiler, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Branimir Jetvai will be speaking about biodiversity conservation and food security. Before we begin, I'd like to state we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we get going, I would just like to note that this is the final webinar for our Prairie's Got the Goods Week, but we also have another webinar series called the Native Prairie Speaker Series, which is a monthly presentation about species at risk. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us next week on March 27th at 12 p.m. for a webinar about pronghorn by Paul Jones from the Alberta Conservation Association. And you can register for that on the PCAP website. If you've missed the other webinars that were happening this week for Prairie's Got the Goods Week, don't worry, we've got them recorded and they are on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/user/skpcap. So you can find them there. Just a reminder to all of our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard anytime during the presentation, and we'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar. And feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. And I'd like to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsor, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, and our supporting sponsors are North American Helium, Nutrien, and SaskTel. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Branimir Jetvai is a Saskatoon-based biologist, environmental photographer, and a dedicated nature conservationist. Branimir is interested in issues at the intersection of land use, biodiversity conservation, and food security. Guided by his environmental and agroecology training, Branimir is seeking solutions to minimize the impact of agricultural intensification on the extent and health of natural ecosystems. He is passionate about supporting and restoring biodiversity in agricultural landscapes through wider adoption of nature-based climate solutions. Branimir has served on the board of directors of several environmental nonprofit organizations and as an appointed member to the University of Saskatchewan Senate. In 2013, Branimir was recognized by the Canadian Environmental Law Association for extensive participation in environmental NGOs and for using his photography to advance environmental conservation. He's published 2 award-winning books on prairie conservation, The Great Sandhills, A Prairie Oasis, and The Islands of Grass. So with that, I'll pass it over to Branimir.
Hello, Caitlin, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the presentation today. Hvala što ste me pozvali na predavanje. Nadam se da će biti zanimljivo I da ćete nešto naučiti novoga. Caitlin is going to monitor chats and questions. When I give presentations, I cannot see your questions, so I apologize. Caitlin, if you see there's something funky is going on, let me know because I have no clue where what is happening. So let's see here. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, that looks good
Excellent.
to go.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, let's keep the questions until the end. And please do not send comments or questions now because that does disturb and disrupt people when the notifications are popping up. So let's start with the presentation here. What I'm going to talk today is about biodiversity conservation and food security, bridging the gap. What I'm trying to do is, here we go already. Here we go. What I'm trying to say here is that we have to rethink how we manage and how we approach biodiversity conservation and also how we manage our land to produce food. So what you see here in the screen is the global risk ranked by severity, and it was conducted by the World Economic Forum. Every year they present this report report. They survey about 1,500 experts, and the question, what do they see? What are the potential risks that we are facing short-term, 2 years, and long-term, 10 years going down the road? And you can see that the first global risks are in environmental area with the weather, decline in the earth systems, and also biodiversity loss, right? And also natural resource shortages, mostly food and other resources that we gain from nature. So when you think about the risk that we are facing now in near past, that we are dealing with climate emergency, that is quite obvious. And we're also dealing with loss of biological diversity that we do not notice very often, but it is there. You probably noticed that we have some problems with pandemic and zoonotic diseases, which, let's say, just to refresh memory, COVID-19 fits into those. So what do they have in common? What they have in common is the land use. How do we manage land? And the way we manage land is also central to addressing the sustainability issues, biodiversity conservation, and how we mitigate the climate change. So we do have to kind of think ahead what we are going to do to minimize all of those risks that we are facing. We don't treat the land very well. Think about what was the first thing that you notice here? What do you think? Where is this forest being burned? Do you think was maybe somewhere in Amazon or somewhere closer? Actually, the land that you see here, the burned aspen parkland, is between Regina and Saskatoon, which the parkland was burned to basically convert the land into the food production. In 2019, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and that is the organization parallel to the IPCC, they released an assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. That landmark report warned that the nature and biosphere integrity are declining globally at a rate unprecedented in human history, which has negative impact on people around the world. The report also stressed the need to fundamentally change how we interact with natural environments. Closer to here home, when we look at the grasslands biome, we are rapidly declining, and this is one of the report that's showing the decline of the bird species, and largest decline is in the grasslands biome, right? So close to home, we have this largest impact of biodiversity decline. So traditional conservation and natural resource management practices, such as agriculture production and growing of food, increasingly be viewed as inadequate to prevent biodiversity loss and natural habitat degradation. Focus of my presentation today is on the lands beyond protected areas, and I will stress the importance and value of small and edge natural habitats in agricultural landscapes. I will show how the non-crop areas contribute to biodiversity conservation and food security at the same time. In the same year, 1915, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change released their own special report on climate change and land, with a warning that we have to fundamentally change how we manage the land, how we produce and consume food, and how do we need to sustainably reduce food waste in order to minimize our effect on the climate change. When we are talking about climate change locally, increases in greenhouse gas emissions have been linked to rising temperature. Since 1948, Canada's annual average temperature over land has warmed by 1.7 degrees Celsius, and Canada is on average experiencing warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. When we look at the Canadian Arctic, it is warming even at a faster rate than the average, up to 3 times faster than the average around the world. So when we're looking at the Environmental Climate Change Canada reports, it identified that, sorry, well, here we go. The warming will also identify with severity of heat waves and contribute to high risk of drought and wildfires. What you see here is pictures from the drought in 2021 in August near Saskatoon. In addition to swings in extreme heat episode, we will see more intensive rainfall, and that will increase the risk of flooding. So what you see here is the image of the flooding in Maple Creek after the week of intense rains in June of 2021. We see here what the scientist, Professor Catherine Hayhoe, named global weirding, that in 1 year, in early 22, daytime temperature low was minus 34 degrees Celsius, and in less than 24 hours, the high daytime was 3 degrees. So we see this swing of 35 degrees Celsius in less than 24 hours. So more extreme temperatures like this we will experience in the future. So I will focus a little bit this part of the presentation on biodiversity conservation, and just to give you a little primer on protected areas. So area-based conservation applications such as the protected areas are the cornerstone of biodiversity conservation. Over the last 10, 15 years, protected areas have expanded from covering 14% to 16.70% of global land and freshwater uses. Other effective, here we go. Other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, if you see the shorthand, can be run by privately through organizations, non-government organizations, for example, Nature Conservancy, community groups, or by indigenous peoples through IPCAs or indigenous protected conservation areas. OECMs have often been overlooked in most national biodiversity policies and strategies over the last decade. The interest for OECMs is rapidly increasing, and they could help to address shortfalls in protected area networks. So here are just the slides that I did some analysis in 2021. The data has not changed, at least not provincially. There's a little bit of additions on the federal level. And that is the amount of protected areas in Canada and Saskatchewan. What we see in 21, Canada managed to protect it officially through protected area networks and OECMs about 14%. Officially, Saskatchewan has protected close to 10%, but that was basically number was achieved with some creative accounting. Realistically, we have in the province about 8.89% of protected areas. Future does not look promising in the province. What I was able to find out, the lands are to the target of 25 was about 12% protected. And when we think about 2030, that plan and goal has not been increased. In Canada, in the world, the target for protected areas is 25% by 25, and then 30% by 2030. And that's also often number that you hear is 30 by 30. So basically what I want to show here is, at least provincially, we cannot count too much on the provincial government to work on increase the protected areas. Increase in protection needs to come from somewhere else, mostly community action and community activities. So see here the picture of Grasslands National Park. It's one of the protected areas. On the biodiversity conservation side of the ledger, large protected areas are managed for the long-term conservation of nature. They provide suitable space for species that are susceptible to disturbance or habitat fragmentation, such as the sage-grouse. Nevertheless, species population within and outside protected areas continue to decline. Even large parks and protected areas will continue to lose species over long term if they're isolated from one another but unsuitable habitat. For example, many migratory species use habitats that are outside of protected areas for a large part of their life cycle. For those reasons, focusing on large protected area conservation strategies alone will not be sufficient without including conservation efforts to protect surrounding small and also isolated habitat patches. This is particularly important in heavily modified human-dominated landscapes such as agricultural land, right? So biodiversity conservation, the effectiveness of protected areas is significantly influenced by the type of land cover and management practices. I showed you here the example of the research that was done in 2019 in neighboring Alberta when they discovered or determined that the quality and effectiveness of protected areas really rely a lot on the quality of the habitat surrounding that protected area. So when we have that in mind, we have to think that the complex matrix of wildlife-friendly landscapes established through working land conservation will complement the protected area networks by providing necessary habitat for some species while assisting dispersal and adaptation to climate change for others. What is important here to understand that habitat connectivity is crucial. The protected area networks need to be complemented by new area-based conservation measures and approaches for conserving biodiversity in the working landscapes, such as agroecological management practices, agroforestry, silvopastures, and other low-intensity land uses. An example of land management strategy that would benefit food production and nature biodiversity are shelter belts and prairie strip on shared lands, so-called wildlife-friendly farming. And I apologize, I do not have any good pictures of prairie strips, but that's a plan for my photography for next year. There are many ecological services provided by natural features in agricultural landscapes, besides providing habitat for wildlife and pollinators. Some of the ecosystem services are soil stabilization, water flow and quality through snow retention, for example, local increase in yields, local increases in crop yields and carbon capture, especially through soil organic carbon balance, and also climate control through the cooling effects. Spatial arrangement of cropland and semi-natural field edges habitats can especially promote functional biodiversity, and then will bring yield enhances ecosystem services in our agri landscapes. So having high quality or quality habitat areas adjacent to our cropland will increase, potentially increase, in many cases, studies have shown, increase the yield through ecosystem services provided by those non-crop areas adjacent to our cropland. Some of the examples could be ditches, road allowances, and so on. So the key point of my presentation is that in addition to creating more protected areas, we need to consider designing agricultural landscapes as a mosaic of land uses, which will consist of agroecology-based farmland, wildlife-friendly working lands, and protected area networks at various spatial scales. Given the evidence that intensified conventional agriculture systems are providing minimal key services beyond provisioning. Future agricultural landscapes will need to be designed to support biodiversity and ecosystem function to secure agriculture system resilience and food security. Reducing native habitat below 20% in agricultural landscape can cause disproportional high loss in patch connectivity, and that could reduce movement of animals between habitat or also plant dispersal, and that would decrease their survival probability. Maintenance of smaller non-crop areas of agricultural lands is very important. Conservation efforts at large scales through protected areas, for example, national parks, they need to be complemented with conservation at smaller spatial scales. So we need to work on conservation of beyond intact ecosystems, or what we consider wilderness. Perennial grasslands, particularly native low-intensity managed grasslands, will capture and store a large amount of carbon below ground, where it is relatively stable through soil organic carbon and inorganic carbon in litter. So what is interesting, where the grasslands have one advantage over forests, especially large areas of boreal forest, in terms of impact of forest fires, or grasslands fire. We know that the majority of organic material is stored underneath the ground. So in cases of fire growing through the landscape, smaller amount of biomass will be burned and release that carbon into the atmosphere. So we look at the total carbon balance. Grasslands are much more kind of prominent and important to have a stable carbon capture that would be forest, for example, right? So if we think about those natural habitat, forests, grasslands, wetlands, as a way of nature-based climate solutions, that will provide immediate opportunity to harness the power of nature to mitigate the effects of climate change. And just as for the definition for the people who are not aware of the nature-based solutions, so those are the actions to protect, manage, and restore forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they will sequester carbon from the atmosphere. What is important to say and note is that nature-based climate solutions cannot be a substitute for a release of greenhouse gas emissions from human activities. There's a research study in 21 showed that nature-based solutions have a potential to cut Canada's greenhouse gas emissions up to 11% of current levels by 2030. In addition, most nature-based solutions, if effectively implemented, also offer co-benefits like water filtration, flood buffering, soil health, biodiversity habitat, and enhanced climate resilience. Nature-based solutions, such as wetlands and prairie buffer strips, will help mitigate the effects of climate change. They will filter and reduce the seeping of agrochemicals into the waterways. I found a study in, when was that, 2019. They looked at the 21 headwater streams located in the southwest Manitoba, and scientists determined that agricultural landscapes need more than 30 to 40% of natural features to reduce the discharge of dissolved organic matter and phosphorus and nitrogen nutrients into stream. So natural features such as wetland will reduce the negative effect of nutrient load in wetlands. Here we see the data of 30 to 40%, which is cool. However, when we think about it, impact of natural features to try to reduce the effect of greenhouse gas emissions, nutrients load, and pollution, we do have to balance that desire to maintain those natural features and the need to produce food. So there needs to be some balance. Right now, balance is quite skewed towards desire to drain everything and burn forests to create more and more cropland, not unfortunately to kind of feed the world, but to produce export commodities. So what should be our priorities for both climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection? So we need to focus on the protection of existing natural landscape to be on the top of the list. So second one would be minimize unavoidable impacts. So we have to properly manage the landscapes. And the third, whatever we don't manage to protect and properly manage, we need to restore the affected landscape. So we do have, for example, PCAP is organizing native prairie restoration reclamation workshops, which are attending more and more attention every year. So this is the part, in addition to protection management, we need to restore. So I'm going to talk a little bit of nature in agricultural landscapes. So the agricultural activity is considered to be the single largest driver of environmental change. Wherever here in North America, over 80% of native grasslands have been converted to crop production or other uses. So we did lose a lot. So what do we see currently our agricultural landscapes? In large parts, I have to mention that this kind of approach to landscape management for food production is predominant. However, we do see, fortunately, we see more and more producers who are really concerned about the impact of food production on the agricultural landscapes, and they're trying to apply regenerative and agricultural practices, which is really cool, and I'm happy to see that. So natural features such as shelter belts and wetlands are being removed from agricultural landscapes at an increasing rate with marginal increases in yields. I found the US study of annual land use changes from 2008 to 2016, where croplands have been expanded at the rate of over 1 million acres per year. Whereas about 70% of the new cropland areas produced yields below the national average, with a mean yield increase deficit of about 6%. So a lot of those areas there for the cropland they're building expanded are marginal to start with. So we really have to think and do a good economic analysis. What is the cost benefit from converted marginal land into crop production? Is it worth it for food or ecosystem services and biodiversity that we lose for those marginal land conversion? That we need to really think and decide what are the decision making, what we want to do. So there we go. Here we go. So agriculture and the global food systems are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss due to habitat loss and habitat change and greenhouse gas emissions impact the climate. At the same time, food production is negatively impacted by those anthropogenic pressures. I found somewhere the comment and term agri-suicide that actually the way we manage the land to produce food quite often has a negative impact actually what our ability to sustainably produce food. So the term was agri-suicide. What do we do and how are we impacted ourselves, right? Okay. Hello. So the threat of the climate change and habitat. Sorry. Oh, here we go. So am I having a problems here? I apologize. So the threat of climate change and habitat degradation have a strong impact on biodiversity as species are forced to adjust and migrate through fragmented landscapes. Are we providing adequate space and well-connected habitat patches for species to move through suitable habitat and survive to produce? Here is some example of the quality of a habitat mosaic. When you look, for example, now, the average agricultural land, we have a lot of land used for the food production, and we have a little patches of natural and semi-natural habitat, which are quite fragmented. And what is happening? If you have a wildlife or a plant species, one of those patches, there is a really a limited probability for successful migration through habitat, and probability of that migration really varies on the habitat quality. What we could do is design our agricultural landscapes. There are some corridors that would allow wildlife and plant species to move through the agricultural matrix and assist that movement through properly designing shelter belts, having prairie strips, or maybe having a natural habitats in the road allowances and the road ditches. So how do we design habitat is important. Here is one example of importance of habitat quality matrix for biodiversity conservation. What I put here, kind of a schematic of two large protected areas, which are getting more and more isolated in sea of unsuitable habitat. To assess functions of those protected areas, we do need, again, to design our landscapes to work as a matrix of multifunctional habitat and habitat that has a different level of habitat quality to assist migration of species, to increase the functionality of our protected areas, but also I will refer later and talk about increase actually ecosystem function and provide those ecosystem services to secure our food system and the resilience of agricultural lands for the food production. The current predominant model of high input intensive production of agricultural commodities, it ranks high in provisioning services, meaning high crop yields, but provide only low level of regulating, supporting, and cultural services. So the agriculture intensification is leading to simplification of landscape structure, leads to loss of biodiversity, and potential reduction in system resilience. So loss of biodiversity threatens provisioning of ecosystem function and services, and that'll ultimately impact food security and agriculture sustainability. Increased diversification increased diversification of crop systems and landscape structure will enhance agro-ecosystem performance and resilience. What we need, we need to upscale the application of regenerative and agroecological farming practices, and that will increase stability of our food system. It will help reduce the amount of agricultural inputs and improve farm profitability, and in many cases without compromising yields. By focusing more attention on biodiversity, and especially functional diversity of ecosystems, enhancing on-farm and landscape scale diversity, we should be able to design and manage agricultural landscapes for better delivery of biodiversity-based ecosystem services and increase stability of food systems. And I apologize here, I had to put a picture, kind of aerial picture of the farmland in Nova Scotia, because I had a hard time finding an aerial view of similar agriculture and ecosystem-based production here in the prairies. We do have them, but I don't have a good picture for now. So how do we get more biodiversity-based ecosystem services? One example are natural and semi-natural prairie and flower strips along the field edges or road allowances that serve as refuge for pollinator and pest controlling insects. And why is that important? Pollinators improve production of 70% of globally most important crop species, and it influences 35% of global food supply. Did you know that up to 40% of pollination is done by insects other than bees? That's why it is important to maintain natural features in agricultural landscapes, such as prairie strips and shelter belts, to provide refuge for those beneficial insects. So what is the path forward? To find common solutions and make the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity vision of living in harmony with nature a reality. We have to bring the gap between agriculture production and nature conservation. We need transformative change and move beyond the quest for sustainable use and focus on our efforts for achieving sustainability through land use. We have to think really hard, how do we design our agricultural landscapes for both food security and nature conservation? To reverse global biodiversity decline, we need to implement ambitious conservation efforts beyond protected areas and implement a transformative change in the food production system. So here's one graph that I just want you to pay attention to. It was designed just to show you the biodiversity decline with the business as usual. Here in the gray line, we are continuously losing species. If we increase our conservation efforts, we might be able, and hopefully we will be able to decline that loss of biodiversity. However, to restore and maybe the bend and change this curve of biodiversity loss, in addition to conservation efforts, we also need to have more sustainable production of food, and also we need to have more sustainable consumption. So we need to change our approach to food systems. So a way forward, we need to reimagine the food system and integrate food production with biodiversity conservation beyond strict protected areas. We need to structure our food system in a way to turn it from a primary threat to primary solution space for human and environmental health. So some of the suggestions for moving forward, what we could do, we have to work with both demand side and supply side access to food production. From the demand side intervention, we need more sustainable consumption. We definitely need to reduce the food waste. And globally, we lose between 30 to 40% of the food that's being produced. And in Canada, I found one study that found we throw away close to 50% of food. We also need to adjust dietary patterns, especially in North America and in advanced developed countries. We need to focus more on a plant-based food. We need to work on the supply side. We need to adopt more nature-friendly farming practices and improve on-farm and supply chain efficiencies. We need to apply more agroforestry and agroecological methods in our food production. And we need to apply more regenerative and restorative farming and ranching practices. And also organic food production has some role to do in it. And thirdly, We need to set aside more land for nature, more protected areas, whether that is in strict protected areas or in other effective conservation managed areas or indigenous protected conserved areas. We also need more land share between nature and food production with the need more wildlife and nature-friendly agriculture. So in closing, without biodiversity and healthy ecosystems, existence of humanity on this planet will be more difficult. If you are a member of conservation community, think about what I'm hoping you to take from this presentation is to protect biodiversity. Protected areas alone or protected area networks will not be enough. If you're a member of the agriculture producer community, what I wanted to show you that biodiversity support ecosystem function, it supports sustainable food production and also supports bottom line. What we need to do, we need a paradigm shift to more transformative system approach to find solutions that will work in synergy to both restore biodiversity, ecosystem health, and improve food security from agriculture side of the ledger. So that would be end of my presentations, and I apologize. I had some glitches here with my notes, but hopefully that was not too disruptive.
Oh, no, not at all. And thank you so much for the fabulous presentation. It's so interesting. And of course, your photos are stunning.
Thank you.
And it was a very, very thought-provoking presentation. I've been making notes in the background here, lots to think about. So thank you, Branimir. We do have a few questions from our attendees, and to all of our attendees, if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard. We've got some time now. So Branimir, the first one is from Elizabeth, and she says, I'm wondering your thoughts on the area of the prairies that was colonized by Europeans over the past century. This area that we might see as the commons, land for all of us and our indigenous stewards as well. Do you see any way of returning to this time again where we all benefit again from the lands as a commons for all living beings?
Do I see any way of returning to this time again?
Mhm.
It will be difficult. First of all, we have much higher population size. We have what, 8 billion people on the planet. So it just physically, we have too many people to kind of return to what we have before. The population sizes were slightly different, and also in terms of technology and a way of life, the impact of the natural environment was way different and more benign than it was through after the European settlement in this area. Even in the times of settlement, the access to the land and the way how we modify the land was not as intensive as it is now. In terms of commons, we do have some land that is basically with a current society structure. We call it the crown land. It is actually the land that belongs to the people. The question is, who are the people that it belongs to, right? So, in terms of colonization, in terms of the settlement, see, my origin is from the Europe, and I can call myself fifth or a sixth nation because over the centuries, over the millennia, there's so much movement in the population that actually you don't know who is first, who is second, right? What the problem that I see now is the social justice and environmental justice in the society that we run now, how we can manage our system to be just and equitable. That's what we need to focus on. As I said to the answer, I do not see the way to return to the time that we had before, but
Mhm.
going forward, we do need to structure our system, structure our society, structure our land use to be more equitable so that all of the members of society do benefit from the nature that provides for us, both through provisioning, giving us food and fiber, but also regulating all of the services that we rely on, that we have clean water, that we have clean air. When I, in my presentations, when I said what irks me when we talk about we need to produce food to feed the world, right? Right now, the world has enough calorie to feed everybody sufficiently. Problem what we have is the food distribution and how we share that food. The question is, we have to ask ourselves, do we produce food or do we produce export commodities? If we say we produce export commodities, then it is more kind of less touchy-feely discussion, and we have to think more, what are the consequences, environmental and social, on the environment and communities? And we have to deal with that rather than, oh, you can't touch it, we can't change anything, because in quote, we have to feed the world.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And a listener named Brian is wondering if you have a list of your references, and he said there's some useful resources there for a class that he teaches.
Sure. Yeah, I can send him that. Yeah.
Okay, I'll
Send
make a note of Brian's name, and then I think I can pull the email address, and we can touch base
uh-huh.
afterwards about it then. Perfect. Um, and Paul is wondering, are there any examples of good policy from government to encourage more conservation-friendly farming of the type that you recommend?
Yes, there are examples, especially now, current federal government is implementing a lot of support services to encourage regenerative farming practices and also applying agroecological practices. We do have also some policies from the provincial government which support from various programs, again, having more nature-friendly and more kind of practices that would take advantage of ecosystem services, which are already provided to us. What I see really going forward and very exciting is a lot of producers are focusing on regenerative practices to restore natural balances in their agricultural systems for various reasons. One is kind of emotional and feeling of justice and feeling of responsibility, how we manage the land. But also we see there's quite a strong economic incentive because using ecosystem processes that producers could reduce, for example, application of fertilizer. They can reduce application of insecticide to control insects that we really do not want in our land. So that will improve the bottom line. And listening to the presentations from producers who practice regenerative or agroecological practices, they show the examples that actually by having a certain practices, they retain healthy soils, they retain wetlands, and they retain water and hydrological, healthy hydrological system on their land, so they're less susceptible to drought conditions. So going forward, do we really want to invest society money in first of all, at the beginning, drain the agricultural land to remove excess water, then just a part of the year we want to remove. And then in the rest of the year, in the summer months, we spend more money to irrigate that land that we drain in the spring, all right? And that costs money, and society is paying for it. Or do we want to support producers to retain some of those natural features, whether they're grasslands that retain moisture, or whether they're wetlands that also retain moisture, and use that residual moisture in the month of the year where we actually need it. And that is going to be a question that we will be facing more often, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Thanks for that answer. Our next question has been upvoted several times. So you
Mhm.
recommended a switch to a plant-based diet in North America as a strategy. The 2023 National Beef Sustainability Assessment showed land use for beef production contributes the majority of critical habitat that wildlife need for reproduction, about 74%, and feeding, about 55%. So
Mhm.
in Canada, conversion of land away from beef production would lead to more biodiversity loss, would it not?
Yes, that is a very good point, and thank you for doing that from anonymous attendee. That's why when I saw this going forward, I put that little picture of a rancher basically moving cattle in the pasture. We do have right now in North America, we do use a lot of meat, right?
Mhm,
So going forward, we could to have a healthy diet, we should reduce the amount of meat in our diet. What we could do, we could improve the quality of that meat, right? And what we could do, we can improve the way how we produce that meat, whether that meat is produced on cattle that is raised on the rangeland, and or whether that cattle is produced in high impact and high intensity feedlot productions, which
mhm,
produce and give us a lot of issues both in health. We see a lot of E. coli outbreaks because feeding beef the food that they're not supposed to eat, feeding cows food they're not supposed to eat, changes pH in a digestive tract, which also brings a lot of E. coli strains, which are not very friendly to humans. Growing beef on the rangeland, you're actually not producing meat. You are managing the grass. We have before we have a large amount of cattle raised on our rangelands. That rangeland was managed, in quote, managed by large herds of herbivores. Cattle kind of mimic that impact of herbivores on the grassland. So having a cattle and producing cattle, so full production, so grass-fed fed and grass-fed finished beef, first of all, it'll be healthy for our diets, even if we have less of it and have more
mhm,
plant-based diets. And also that beef production is very important for maintaining those natural habitats. They're very important for providing ecosystem services, soil retention, carbon sequestration, water balance. But also those rangelands are very important for biodiversity protection. So that question that I said is, so in Canada, conversion of land away from beef production, would it lead to more biodiversity loss? Yes, indeed. It will definitely need more to biodiversity loss. So we need to put more effort in supporting this kind of food production and also food production that will maintain healthy native prairie rather than having maybe food production in intensive feedlots. So thank you for that question.
yeah, that was a good
I
one.
mean, society needs to problem what we have now, the profitability of beef production on a native rangeland is much lower than profitability by using that land where you can, using that land for crop production, especially, for example, canola and wheat. So that economic incentives, it's really skewed towards cropland. Not all land can be used for cropland. The problem is once you convert the land to cropland, it is next to impossible to revert it back to the healthy, diverse native prairie.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we learned in yesterday's webinar that land that's been restored back or tame land, like land that's been previously cultivated, doesn't store the amount of carbon that native grasslands do. Yeah.
And that is too, like the speaker, I listened to him a few years ago, and the question was, what would be the best policy? And he said, in terms of climate and carbon capture, he said that the best policy would be not to incentivize incentivize the native prairie conservation, but actually penalize conversion of
Hmm.
native prairie into cropland. But politically, they will not fly, right? So sometimes good policy is different from good politics. So that is the issue.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Our next question is from Candace Savage. Candace says, great photos. I definitely agree. We've had a few comments about that. And first of all, you noted that we cannot rely on public protected lands to meet the 30 by 30 target in Saskatchewan. This slipped by quickly, so it's not clear. Is this because it's impossible or because it's politically unlikely?
So federally, we might be able to reach that goal. Provincial, we are not going to reach that goal. First of all, because there's no political desire or political incentive.
Mhm.
Um, we could, what is happening, we do get a large number of areas in North Canada, which is really easy to create large protected areas. And we see impetus and tendency to create those OACMs, other effective conservation measures, and conservation through working lands. What we need to understand is because of the high population size, we cannot have, it's really nice dream to have half Earth protect 50% of the land. However, considering the population side, we do need to feed whatever 8 billion people we have, right?
Mhm.
So in addition to strictly protected areas, which are beneficial and absolutely necessary for species who cannot handle disturbance, whether that is traffic or a noise, for example, sage grouse, we do need areas that we need protection for working lands where we use this, include wildlife and nature-friendly agricultural land, both for the biodiversity, to reach that goal, but also to increase the resilience of our food system. So that 30 by 30 goal, hopefully we'll be able to reach it on the federal level, but I don't think we will reach it on the provincial level.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. Kaylee is wondering, she says, I work in the public health sector as a nutrition professional, and I would also add to your last slide that for health professionals, focusing on human health isn't enough. We need to understand the interconnections between ecology, agriculture, and human health when we are making nutrition and health recommendations. The focus on plant-based proteins in the 2019 Canada's Food Guide is a step forward. Do you have any comments about that?
Yes, I did recently see a lot of, sorry, not a lot, a few high quality research being done linking human health and environmental health. And that is
Mhm.
what we see here with why there is an impetus and kind of support and focus on working on plant-based diets, which have slightly less impact on the environment and food production. So we use less input in terms of water use, nutrient use, calories, and so on. So that quality of the food is important for human health, right? Where we have a fewer diseases which are brought in by bringing that heavy protein-based diets that we can avoid, both having then that question of human health and environmental health are really strongly linked. So that is one of the ways in on dietary changes where possible, with caveat that using the land and using the rangeland and growing the food, growing or producing protein, we feed people, we feed humanity, but we also maintain some of the important habitat for biodiversity. So that has to be taken into consideration and balance. How do we manage the land, right? Because if you do have a field of chickpeas, or you have a piece of lentils, that field will feed people, but it will not provide habitat for wildlife, quality habitat that native prairie would.
Absolutely. We're running tight on time here. So okay if I ask you one more question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's been a few people that are interested in knowing or that have commented farmers are interested in environmental issues, but it also needs to be financially viable for them to do the changes. It's their livelihood, it's how they support their families. There needs to be some help or incentive to do so. It seems like there's funding possibilities, through Alice Canada, different watershed organizations, Cows and Fish, but and another person is asking what's happened to the idea of paying farmers or ranchers for providing EGS? Any comments or thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have. I think it is important to pay for ecosystem services, provisioning of ecosystem services. One caveat that I'm a little bit reluctant is that once you stop that payments, what is driving the decision making to maintain that habitat? If you really, your survival of your operations really relies of your decision whether you maintain the grasslands or you try to convert it into the cropland, then you will make that decision because you need to survive, you need to feed your family. So one example in did have a system with conservation reserve program. When the funding dropped or was reduced, there was an uptake in the prairie conversion, right? Which is pure economics. So that the problem, how do we do to maintain those payments for ecosystem services? One thing that we need to do, when I mentioned about we need to transform our food system, we need to incorporate the cost of food production and incorporate the cost of food in our food system. So producers need to be paid in the first place for the cost of the food that they produce. Very often what we have is that the intermediaries between producer and consumers are skimming the top, and then we're losing that value. If we could produce a system where there is a more direct connection between the producers and consumers, that actually consumers will pay same amount of money, but more of that money will go directly to producers themselves, right? So you have that pools or maybe co-ops and linkages between producers, direct linkages producer to consumer, which there's a little bit tricky on the large markets. On the smaller markets, they already exist. How do we implement that in really highly specialized distribution system in North America is going to be tricky. So it's not going to be absolute solution, but that is one of the possible solutions that we need to consider as well.
Absolutely. So we're kind of out of time here, but there's been some interest in your books. Do you have any copies left? How can people get a hold of your books?
Yeah, just Google my name and there'll be website and there'll be email, contact me, or Caitlin will have my contact address. So basically, one of my alternate lives is photography, and I use photography to, first of all, get me out of the house and not stare at the computer nonstop, but also to use my photography skills to promote biodiversity conservation. And more, I am interested in the food systems because, again, if we just try to kind of focus on strictly biodiversity conservation without taking into consideration how our decisions of food production how our activities for the biodiversity conservation impact ability to provide food. So the goal of my presentation today is that we have to look at a bigger picture. We have to look at various aspects: biodiversity conservation, food production, and climate change. But there are solutions that will help us deal with all of these three problems in one swoop.
Well, that's all the time that we have. I know there's lots more questions left, but I think people can maybe reach out to you directly if they wanted an answer, if that's okay. But I really want to pass on some of the amazing comments that are coming in here from Trevor. Terrific presentation, Branimir. The research you did for this must have taken hours. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation from Al. Michael says, great presentation, Branimir. Thank you. So I just want to reiterate those comments. Thank you. It's very thought-provoking. And of course, your pictures are phenomenal. So
Thank you.
thank you very much for doing the webinar with us today.
Caitlin, there's possibility that you save those questions and answers?
I can pull them up for you after.
Yeah, that'll be good because
Okay.
there are some questions we were not able to answer,
It's a
so
lot.
I can contact people directly.
Sure. Yeah, I can send you that list afterwards. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for catching our final webinar for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. We'll have it uploaded onto the YouTube channel in the near future. You can always subscribe to the YouTube channel so you get notified when there's actually a new video that's listed up there. And you can catch all of the other webinars that have happened this week on there as well. So and Branimir, there's been like another half dozen people that have written in. Thank you. Fantastic presentation, wonderful presentation. So thank you. Okay, everyone. When you leave today's webinar, there's a quick 1-minute survey. And as always, we really appreciate your feedback. Even if you're an ordinary woman with big dreams, we want to hear from you. That's right. I pulled that from one of our surveys. Always gives me a little chuckle when I see that one on there. So thanks, everyone. And hopefully we'll catch you at our Native Prairie Speaker Series webinar in the future. And have a great rest of your day. Bye now.